This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. And welcome back to the City of God podcast, where we are weekly exploring today's biggest cultural issues all through the lens of God's infallible word. I'm Rob Pacienza, and as always, joined by my co-host, John Rabe. John, great to see you today.
Great to see you, Rob. I'm looking forward to the discussion that we have today. A repeat guest. We're going to get into some very interesting stuff, very applicable to parents and children especially.
Absolutely. We're joined here today by my good friend, Dr. Joel Satterly, who is the headmaster of Westminster Academy, and he is here to talk about education as a whole in America. A lot to unpack, a lot to uncover. We're going to talk about higher education, public education, and the mission field that Joel has committed his career to, Christian education in particular. I think it's important to say that this podcast is produced in conjunction with the Institute for Faith and Culture, of which Dr. Satterly is a contributor to the Institute. So, Joel, welcome back to the City of God.
Thanks for having me.
And just to, for those who are not in the South Florida area who will watch this and listen to this, it's just worth noting, Westminster Academy is the K through 12 school founded by...
Pre-K. Pre-K through 12.
Thank you. Founded by Dr. D. James Kennedy. And when now? How long?
1971.
1971. So we're in the 54th year of existence now here for Westminster. And for those outside of South Florida, this is a very, and I don't mean to embarrass either of you guys who have been involved in this. Rob, you went there. This is a very highly regarded educational institution here in South Florida, Christian or otherwise, very high. So that's the kind of the credentials that we're dealing with. That we talk with.
Christian college prep school that has an incredible reputation, not only throughout the region, everywhere I travel. When I tell them Westminster Academy, Fort Lauderdale has a reputation and a legacy across the nation. And so we're grateful for our founder, but also grateful for the continuing of that legacy through Dr. Satterly.
Yes.
So Joel, let's dive in. Let's start first with higher education. I think the three of us would agree, but love to get your perspective that higher education in the 21st century is no longer about academic achievement, but it's about indoctrination.
Yeah, very, very much. We've seen it very recently on national display. Used to be, of course, that field was one driven by meritocracy. A good example of that, I just recently found some time to watch Christopher Nolan's biopic Oppenheimer.
Yes. And
to see the gathering of minds and the rallying of the American higher education system around that project is not something we would see today. There would be difficulty. In fact, there's a great just saw it the other night. It's still fresh in mind. There's a great scene where Matt Damon is playing General Leslie Groves is asked in 1953 if he would have cleared Oppenheimer according to these standards, and he quickly said no. But I wouldn't have cleared any of them with these current set of standards of how it was just an example of how things had changed.
Yeah, and so, there's obviously a major cultural component to this, to the reason that education has changed and that we don't, on average, produce the minds that we used to produce. I mean, you go back, you've seen various articles and memes even about this, but you go back and look at questions that a school kid would have answered in the 17 or 1800s, and you couldn't get graduate students to answer those same questions now. So we've had sort of a dumbing down of America, but this is at least part of that. There may be multiple causes in that, but would you say that this change in education is at least a significant contributor to that dumbing down of America?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that's true. To your point, we can look at some of those things that are historical artifacts to see that. But it's as education has shifted its aim ultimately and moved away from what it was intended to do, train minds. Even if we're thinking secularly, just in that realm,
right?
To train minds to becoming much more an instrument of socialization and has become something else entirely. So when your aim changes, the results will.
If you could just explain that a little bit further, because that's a really interesting point, the difference in those aims, the difference between, building the mind and the socialization. What do the differences look like in education there?
Yeah, I think if you look at in the history of our country, when the North American church is strong, and the North American family is strong, then the school is freed to be the school, to be the school, to be the place where education is pursued, academic learning is pursued. When and other institutions around it are coming to support. When you begin to see the erosion of those public institutions, which we've seen, our public has turned to that which has remained, the schoolhouse. And so more is foisted upon that organization than was originally intended. And there's only so much time.
They were not originally supposed to raise your children. They were supposed to educate your children. Now they're supposed to raise.
The family raises the child.
Nor were they supposed to feed your children, for that matter, or clothe your children.
Interesting.
That's right.
So the temptation can be for people listening or watching this podcast, here are three guys, they're being an alarmist. They're talking about the radicals taking over all of the institutions, but we just saw it for ourselves. Just a few weeks ago, we saw 3 Ivy League presidents testify before Congress, and not one of them could condemn the genocide of the Jewish people that is blatant and clear as day. What are your thoughts on kind of what we're seeing unfold before our very eyes concerning the radicals that are being put in place in positions of higher education?
Well, let's start by, I don't think any of us are being alarmist.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. I mean, that may be an accusation.
Sure.
Yeah.
But that's certainly not the case as we see all of this unfold in front of us. To what you're mentioning, Rob, I think one of the things that was really interesting was to examine the credentials of those people. So just to look at a place of higher education, a place like Harvard, and Harvard's become, if we're fair, we saw, Harvard's kind of become an easy whipping boy lately.
Yep.
Certainly they've put themselves there, but that's where people have turned. But you look at Dr. Gay, who was president at the time, and with that controversy, people began to look even at her academic background, and it became hard to fathom how does such a limited academic background land there in the presidency. And I think you have to then ask, when you ask that why, you start working backwards. And obviously the choice to place her there was valuing something that had not been valued before. There was a shift in those values. And so you saw other things. So a lot of times it's called DEI, but other kinds of initiatives became more important than those academic pursuits, which really begins to beg the question, then what are we trying to do here?
Yeah, and these are our institutions of higher learning. And as you said, we're valuing things that we didn't value before, and conversely, we're no longer valuing the things that we once valued. And that's where you really see, I think, the stark contrast here. I think we're all in favor of things like diversity properly defined. But when that diversity starts to mean that we take superficial characteristics like race and apply them above what you're actually supposed to be doing, like being a scholar or being a doctor or being an airline pilot, that's where things rather go south. And we're applying it to the leadership of Harvard, but this sort of this sort of strange idea of a diversity has gotten hold everywhere, where there are so many things now that are not valued as they once were, and instead we're elevating these superficial characteristics to prominence. And schools feel the pressure to conform to that, I would imagine.
Certainly. I think that's why affiliations and associations provide some safe haven. Part of Westminster Academy's story that helps satisfy some of that concern would be being anchored in and with Coleridge, and that in that partnership and in that how we've approached it, how Dr. Kennedy saw it, and Dr. Wackus, who was the longtime headmaster at Westminster, saw this as having that firm anchor to be able to resist some of those shifting tides and not worry about answering the contemporary siren song, if you will, to that end. Also, I think as we look at this together, This is why we talk about biblical worldview. It really matters. It's what the Institute cares about. Westminster Academy deeply cares about it. Coleridge does, something Rob and I share in common, our interest in that. And, John, to your point, understood biblically, diversity is a beautiful thing.
Right.
One body, but many parts.
Yep.
Yeah.
One day all the nations will bow, right?
All nations, all people of different kinds.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an amazing, biblical diversity is just an amazing phenomenon. But when diversity becomes an end unto itself and is driven not biblically, but ideologically, now you wind up with something altogether completely broken.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard somebody say recently that our universities are no longer run by trustees or presidents, but really HR departments.
Yeah, that's true of corporate America
and the
too.
DEI that is just kind of inundating our institutions that were once great in this nation and now floundering. Now, okay, we've picked on the Ivy Leagues, we've picked on the universities. Time to look at our public school system here in America as well. I mentioned in a sermon just a few weeks ago this concept of equity grading, and it was kind of new to me, but it kind of explain the whole concept of equity grading and why, once again, we're seeing kind of this indoctrination, not from the perspective of wanting the best for our students and for our children and basing a system on achievement, academic achievement, but once again, just indoctrination that is absolutely detrimental to these children, but society as a whole.
Yeah, well, it's based on the premise that students can't handle defeat, or they can't handle not being successful. So we create artificial success. Yeah. So we're going to give everybody a trophy. That would be an earlier manifestation of this. Or we're going to grade in such a way that we don't call it plagiarism, we call it something else, or we give how you tried, so we're going to award something for trying, which we know in the real world that leads to bankruptcy, and that doesn't go very far. Yeah. But it's driven out of this shifting mindset, and maybe one of the places to think about it is when we got sideways about what is the nature of man. So when we understand rightly that man is human beings are made in the image of God, we bear the imago Dei. That's really important. But yet we're fallen, but we're endowed with certain things from our Creator. I believe I read that in a document.
Exactly.
Yeah, it sounds pretty clear.
And this is true in that school becomes one of the places where those things are honed and teased out and given those opportunities to excel. And we recognize differences. Everybody doesn't read at the same rate, or everybody's not 6'8". Yeah. Right? Yep. I mean, but yet somehow we've gotten confused here and said, no, man is something different than that. And so we have to create this artificial environment where everybody feels good.
I heard one school board president say, we can't give students zeros because it would be too detrimental to their self-esteem. Yeah. So that you don't turn an assignment, you get a 50. No more zeros.
That's a starting point. That's a starting point. Don't even take the test.
Exactly. I mean.
Yeah. Try telling that to your employer.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And that's what's so short-sighted about this.
Yeah.
I remember years ago, and I'm sure that the exact numbers have changed, but it still tells the story. I remember R.C. Sproul talking about test scores, and when tested in math, Japanese students finished #1 in the world. But when you ask them how they felt about their performance, they finished well below that in the lower teens. Conversely, in the United States of America, and this is going back to the 80s or the 90s, America had finished something like 16th in the world in math scores. But #1 in how good they felt about how they had done in math. And we've just seen that now writ large, and it's even broader, and it's seeped into church culture, where you have the largest, I think the largest mega church in America that doesn't like to talk about sin because people get beat up enough. It makes them feel sad. It makes them feel bad about themselves. Yet when we did talk about sin, we did a lot better in this sort of thing. So Let's talk about the way that it's changed. It changed in terms of the sexual brainwashing that's now taking place in public schools as well. And again, we say people, oh, you're being an alarmist. All you have to do is flip open TikTok, where you can find hundreds, if not thousands, of videos of teachers talking about how in their classroom they help facilitate their grade school children's transitions or coming out or so forth.
Right. Drag queen story hour.
Right. So we have a serious thing. How did these things even get connected? How is it happening that this sexual ideology is being promoted on a pretty wide scale to even grade school children?
Well, to go back to Sproul, ideas have consequences.
Yes.
Right, and that's what we're seeing. My wife Carol recently said, "I think we're living in Hunger Games." This sort of thing. We're talking about this, and I think there's some realization. But I mean, ideas do have consequences, and we are reaping the fruit of the sexual revolution, are we not?
Sure.
And that's part of what we're seeing. And again, you go back to what is the nature of man? Gender is something to be discovered, not something that's not something that's endowed. That's where we get our worldview sideways. Something for me to define. To be able to, I heard Tim Keller, the late Tim Keller, in a podcast recently talking about, it was an older sermon, but he was talking about the various standards that people apply to themselves, the world standards, God's standards, and their own standard. Mm-hmm. And he joked and said, some of you would rather have your own standard, and I'd like to point out to you kindly that your standards are very low. And I think that, I thought the point was well made about that, to be able to wrestle. And so it's God's standard that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah. Ideas do have consequences, and God's design is that the parents would be the fundamental disciplers and shapers of their child's mind and their heart and their soul. We have the Secretary of the Department of Education recently said that actually teachers know more than the parents do.
Yeah.
You being a champion of instilling a biblical worldview in the next generation, you wrote your doctorate thesis on this. You talked about the connection between the Christian day school and having a biblical worldview. Why does a biblical worldview just basically tear that argument to shreds, that teachers know more than parents and that we should basically just get off their backs and let them teach whatever we want them to teach to our children?
Well, we could turn right to the divine institution of the family.
Yeah.
Really appreciated as you've been preaching through the confession recently, and what happens when we read Genesis through that lens, and we see how things were ordered.
Yep.
And the structure of those things. Famously in our industry, everybody runs to Deuteronomy 6 to talk about the role of the parents. I prefer Psalm 78 because it's the first 8 verses are both a pedagogical transition all the way through, but it's a generational one. And both are obviously both very valid, but it shows that. And again, we've gotten confused. Parents don't want to parent. What am I supposed to do? And our society is championing bureaucrats in this regard. Nobody is asking the question, on what basis would such a claim be made? Demonstrate how a teacher would know more about this than a parent. Yeah. I haven't heard anybody ask that question yet. It would be interesting, the response of the
It would, and I guess in a strange way you can see how the hard left has sort of taken the opportunity that's been afforded, saying, if you're going to let us raise your children, then we're going to do the job. We're going to raise them exactly the way that we want them to be. You could almost wish that Christian parents en masse were as dedicated to the raising of their children as the leftist state seems to be. Yes. So what needs to change? And you deal with a lot of Christian families who've made in many cases, the sacrificial choice to send their kids to a school at expense to themselves to get a Christian education. What do you see needs to change? Maybe where do you find that switch gets flipped in parents where they realize, what, this is the way. I cannot have my kids in this system. I have to put them someplace where God comes first.
Well, I think that's the role of ministries like this one. It's also the role of the church, I think, is that's being preached. Thank God ours faithfully does that. it's hard for a school to convince parents that that's true.
Yeah.
It has to be from the places. Recently, we did an event showcasing our high school to our 8th grade parents. And maybe it was a silly question to ask them, but I asked them to raise their hand. How many of them were consulting with their 8th grader on their investments? And before your next stock purchase, are you going to ask your 8th grader their opinion? And of course, no hands went up. And so then my query of them was, then why are you asking them where they want to go to school? Because where they're going to school is a much more substantive question.
Talk about an investment.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think those kinds of things, and I think parents, Christian parents coming to shift from being passive to active. And, you mentioned the radical left. We were talking about this before we started a minute. That's an ideological conviction, and one of the things, to our shame, I think, in the Western Church, is we are not living in a way where we're embracing the passionate pursuit of our theology in the manner in which the radical left are embracing the radical pursuit of their ideology, and so we're seeing that, I think.
So let's talk about Christian. I think that's a good segue into Christian education. We've talked about higher education. We've talked about the public school system in America. In the 21st century, why is Christian education so vitally important to a flourishing society?
It's a great question. Think of it this way. I was just talking to some of our high school students about this recently. The amount of information that a 16-year-old is asked to process from the time they get up in the morning until they walk in the gate of Westminster Academy is extraordinary. Just what they're being asked to process. What do we think is going to happen if we're not giving them the tools to process it by? So recognizing that the 21st century is different. Information is instantaneous. It's driven by pop culture and survey and crowdsourcing, and we have to understand that and be able to talk with our students about that clearly, not out of fear, but out of equipping and empowering. I think that's the way forward.
Yeah.
I am an elder. I'm not a senior pastor as you are, Rob, but we are churchmen. We are, people involved in making decisions and even casting vision for churches and for Christian institutions. I have been feeling more and more strongly lately, and I want to get your opinion on this, Joel, that, when people ask me, what can the church do? What does the church need to do in the culture? How do we stop this slide? I think the best answer, and I recognize this is easier said than done, it's do what Dr. Kennedy did. Start a school. Now, again, I know that not every church is equipped to do that, but frankly, when Dr. Kennedy decided to do it, it's not like it was just already sitting there waiting to cut the ribbon. Somebody had to decide to fund that and to have a vision for that. But it seems to me that the demand far exceeds the supply for Christian education right now. And what can churches be doing to facilitate that beyond just telling parents you need to get your kids a Christian education? What should churches actually be doing to make that happen?
Well, it might help if seminaries started teaching pastors as they're coming through that a Christian day school is really a great thing to have and not a detriment.
Yeah, that's good.
And most of our seminaries aren't.
Yeah.
There's not a course on that. Yep. That may be an idea. I think, to your point about our place, about Coleridge and Westminster, in 1971, not only was there not a school just to walk into, those parents believed in this so much and were motivated by this so much, they sent their children to rented space at the Pompano Beach horse track. Now, if we were to go and start a school today in the 21st century, to your point, Rob, how many Christian parents would do that? Instead, they want a real blown full school experience. And that's wonderful. And we're blessed to be in a place to provide that. But that wasn't the case in 1971.
There's a pioneer spirit involved.
And we've lost that. We're not in a pioneering season anymore. And I appreciate that. And so it's not a hearkening to go back to that day. But we ought not neglect what fueled those pioneers and to look at that. I'd also suggest maybe a single church, in today's economic reality, a single church may not have the resources, but a group of churches coming together in a community could. And setting aside, it's why, what the confession is such a powerful tool, maybe, Rob, to think about. Those are things we can agree on. Let's come together around that and shape something and pool our resources instead of trying to go it alone. Mm-hmm. That would be one. And the other would be, we're thinking about this a little bit more and more, and I'm talking with colleagues about this across the country. Christian school groups are thinking about, rather than getting mega schools and bigger, which are still limited geographically. There's only so far people drive. Is what if we took a page from churches and started thinking about planting schools? What would a planting school network look like? We have several church planting networks.
Yeah. What about a school planting?
What a school planting network? Now the challenge there is, just like with the church, there's a lot of capital at stake.
Yeah.
But it's a problem to solve.
Yeah. When Dr. Al Mohler was here a couple of years ago, he made the comment concerning Coleridge and Westminster and said something along the lines of, if we needed as a society Coleridge and Westminster Academy in the 60s and 70s, how much more do we need them today? Yeah. And I think that speaks for churches that are preaching God's word faithfully and Christian day schools that are continuing to advance the development of a biblical worldview in the next generation. I think it's so important to be reminded of the Christian day school and the role that it continues to play in the 21st century. I love your thoughts on this. Would it be fair to say that, let's just take Westminster Academy as a model, that the Christian day school that you're leading, Westminster Academy, actually looks more like the schools that were established in the founding of our nation than even the public school system of today?
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
That there's a lot of similarities there.
Of course there are.
Yeah.
Certainly there are. If we go back to those were founded. Our public school system were founded by Puritans. Yeah. Right.
Yep.
They
Harvard,
around biblical literacy.
Princeton. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Both our public schools and our higher ed, right, were very much theological in their orientation. That's what they existed to do. Yeah. And that would very much square with where.
Yeah. It's just interesting when you hear people. When you hear people say, "Well, we're a secular nation and a Christian day school. What role does that play in America?" You just have to look back in history and see the role that it played in both the public school system and higher education. So when we think of a biblical worldview, it's something that we talk a lot about on this show. We talk about at Westminster and Coleridge Presbyterian Church, for instance. For those that are tuning in for the first time, what do we mean by biblical worldview, and how does it apply to what you're doing as a headmaster?
The best way to think about a worldview, I think, is you can either use the image of a lens or a grid. So, we all have one. How well developed and how intentionally, thoughtfully trimmed and cultivated is it? But it's how we look at the world and make sense of it. Yeah. Biblical worldview, then, is a worldview informed by the Scripture that is intentionally shaped and cultivated so that we can think Christianly, to borrow from an old Harry Blameyer's title from the 60s. And I think that's what we mean. We distill it in our at Westminster, as we're training our faculty and having conversation around this, into three fundamental questions: who is God? What is the nature of man? And the third one, I borrowed from a friend of our ministry, Oz Guinness, who I think sat here recently. Yes. What do you do with freedom? Yeah, and you put those three together. I think the freedom piece is Oz has pointed out, is really germane to Americans. So thinking about those. And then we look at everything that we're doing through that lens and how we're engaging students and how we're thinking about curriculum and discipline and athletics and the arts. I mean, all of that has to inform what we're doing. And forming a biblical worldview has always required intention. We live in a fallen world. We are sinners ourselves, and so we're always being swayed away from a biblical worldview and toward a worldly view that's got falsehoods built into it. But never has it been more necessary to be intentional than now? As much as the world has always pushed against us, we talked about this, Rob, many times on this program. But you're dealing with pre-K through 12th graders every day. The
onslaught, the tsunami of stimulus, of input, of the world's messaging and the world's ideology from every corner, never ceasing. It's, I grew up in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. It's breathtaking compared to what I grew up with. And I was part of the TV generation.
Sure. Right.
My parents thought what we were going through was breathtaking compared to growing up with radio. But it's profound now. And so the intentionality really has to be there more than ever.
Absolutely. We just had an opportunity to be with our upper school students this week, memorializing a wonderful teacher who succumbed to cancer recently, Gary Chapman. He was an almost 2-decade teacher at Westminster. And it gave us a chance to ask something, maybe, John, that speaks to what you're saying. We're able to ask our students, what does greatness look like? And where is that being informed from? And it's interesting coming right off the Super Bowl and, seeing, I think $2.5 million was the cost for a 30-second spot in this year's Super Bowl, right? Yeah. And people spend a lot of time trying to teach us what does greatness look like. And Gary Chapman was a man who, so the world says you have to be rich, powerful, beautiful, influential, right? All these things to be great. Gary Chapman was a man who made a very modest salary as a 5th grade Christian school teacher. I believe if you look at his influence, his eternal influence of the difference that he made, not just teaching students math, of which he was very good, but the number of students that came through our school that Gary Chapman introduced them, because at that age is a good time, to the reality of their eternal destiny and who Jesus is. What an incalculable influence. That's what greatness looks like. And I think calling that out, holding that up, because the world is holding up this. We have to show them something else. We have to show them, the world is showing counterfeit. We have to show them real.
That's a good word. And I hope that every parent and grandparent and anyone that's concerned about the next generation listening to this podcast takes a real hard, serious look at what's happening in the state of education in America. But it doesn't just sit there and just complain and be overwhelmed by the cultural moment, but there are opportunities to do something about it.
Right.
Prayerfully consider where your child is being educated. Prayerfully consider where you're going to send them off for 4 years of college and university. And I think this is a great opportunity and moment to support Christian educational institutions and Christian educators. They exist in almost every city, in every region. I want to give a plug to Westminster Academy. If you're not familiar with the ministry of WA, you can go to wa.edu, find out more about this institution, like I said, that has a legacy and an impact and influence all across the nation, if not the world. And we're thankful for you, Joel, for your commitment to the Christian Day School, commitment to a biblical worldview. It's a shining example in the midst of a very dark cultural moment, but it gives us great reason for hope. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Joel. Appreciate it.
And that's a wrap for the City of God podcast. We pray that you enjoyed this conversation on education with our good friend, Dr. Joel Satterly, who is the headmaster of Westminster Academy and also a contributor for the Institute for Faith and Culture. If you were encouraged or inspired by today's episode, we pray that you would pass this along to a family member or friend that wants to engage today's biggest cultural issues all through the lens of God's infallible word. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the City of God. The City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. Visit us at cityofgodpodcast.com to access all of our previous episodes. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or anywhere you get podcasts. A full video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.